Governor Scott Walker recommended a $68 billion two-year budget. He gave that to lawmakers on Tuesday. $31.9 million of that would come from state tax revenues, and there's nobody to talk about this budget better with than Todd Berry, president of the Wisconsin Taxpayer Alliance. Todd, welcome back.
Maybe not.
Well, you and I are both been accused of being budget wonks, but let me ask you this. Remember what he said? I think he said it in Iowa. That's a political context. Be big and be bold. Do you find anything big and bold in this, sir, in this budget?
Well, there might be some big and bold talking points, but I mean, in terms of nuts and bolts budgeting, the one sort of big idea here that's at least new in Wisconsin is the notion of rethinking the way we govern and finance public universities.
Mm-hmm. The 26 campus UW system that spends $6 billion a year.
Now, having said that, this is not a new idea in American public higher ed, because for years states have been starving public universities because they've had to fund Medicaid and school aids, and so as over time the universities have been saying, well, if you're not going to give us any money, then stop micromanaging us. And that's essentially what's the discussion that's going on here, except that he's asking that he's giving them the flexibility and asking that they generate the savings on day one, which is a little bit hard to do.
Well, he doesn't give them, he converts the regents to an authority, but not for 2 years. Meanwhile, in this interim 2 years, we're going to freeze tuition. We're going to block grant you at $750 million, $780, depending on the numbers that you read. And we're going to cut state aid, the GPR subsidy, by $150 million. Now, what I'm struck by is when you look at Superior, 32% of their budget comes from GPR. Platteville, Whitewater, 15%. So what, if it becomes law, what type of squeeze does it pose on a campus-by-campus basis?
Yeah. And actually, I would think that the GPI percentages at a place like Whitewater or Platteville would be higher than that. But certainly, the Madison campus has been in that kind of 15% range. And the reason simply is when you have $800 million, $1 billion in research money and people throwing $50, $100 million at you for various projects, the Madison campus has a lot more options financially. It can also charge, well, it isn't charging quite market, but it's close to market tuition to out-of-state students. Probably an asterisk to all this is I wonder if this is the end of Minnesota tuition reciprocity, because they're going to need to charge full freight to out-of-state students. So Madison, this isn't as big of a hit. Madison's been sort of quasi-private, quasi-public for a long time, but you get to some of these out-state campuses, there's no endowment, there's little or no research money. They're principally funded, as a lot of small private colleges are, that on whose board I sat. They get tuition, and in the case of public universities, they get general fund revenues, but they're not a lot more.
Todd, you said this is part of a national trend. I couldn't agree more. Is it wise policy to adopt this to 2 years from now, give the authority and not the regents complete autonomy over these 26 campuses?
Are you asking me to take the cuts early and? No,
is it wise public policy to 2 years from now?
Oh. Well,
apart from the political.
Yeah. If you're going to ask them to do the cuts now, then you better give them the authority pretty soon. To be honest, if you're a typical university, and you're getting this amount for alumni and this amount from students and this amount from, generous research grants or whatever, then why should the public Board of Regents be entirely appointed by the public governor?
Because state senators like Steve Nass are very afraid 2 years from now, if you create the authority, they're going to say we've had 4 years of a tuition freeze, and we're going to hit residents and their parents with 10, 12, 15, 18% tuition, and we will have given away our oversight that we've been exercising for 150 years.
Well, I'm sort of I'm sort of entertained a little bit by people that tend to be market-oriented but don't want the university to be market-oriented. What will happen? We're basically going to move from a low tuition, low financial aid kind of model to more of an East Coast model, which is a higher tuition, but then you appropriate more financial aid. So, if legislators, and if you're competing in the market for higher ed, you can't just willy-nilly increase tuition, because the students will say, people tend to forget that the private colleges in Wisconsin, the Beloits, the Lawrences, the Rippons, don't cost what their tuition says, because privates buy down that through various merit aid, need-based aid, and so forth. And quite often, they know exactly what the public tuition is, and they try to get right in there and charge about the same.
If the governor's plan is approved, there will be severe fiscal constraints on the UW campuses for the first 2 years. Do you expect layoffs? Is that a reasonable specter? And let me ask you about one more thing. State Senator Bob Wirch of Kenosha is very afraid. He told me yesterday, this is his words, not mine, this $150 million cut could raise the possibility UW Parkside might have to close. So are those reasonable scenarios? Layoffs and...
Well, I don't know. To be honest, the political history of the state shows that it's impossible to close a campus.
Yes, it does.
And that's why, when you have a 63-seat Republican majority in the Assembly, it's not a 51-seat majority where everybody has to march in step. And where is this majority made? It's made in places like, near La Crosse, near River Falls, Eau Claire, Whitewater, Oshkosh, Green Bay. I mean, Parkside. You get the picture. And then you have all these 13 two-year campuses, Marinette, Barron, Richland Center, goes on and on.
Right.
And legislators, represent their local communities to some degree. They're going to talk to local businesses and local parents and local campuses, and they're probably going to, as the plaque says, they're going to sift and winnow a little bit. So, we'll see. We'll see what happens.
And the governor's budget says, if you don't want to cut $150 million to the UW system schools in the first year, you come up with the money. It says that to lawmakers. And are we done talking about higher ed? Because I just find it fascinating. We could do the whole show on higher ed, but let's move on.
Yeah. Well, it's the only big idea in the budget, and it's worth talking about because it's happening all over the country. In fact, there was an award-winning article published a few years ago in a higher ed journal that talked about how higher ed has become the flywheel on which states balance budgets.
Let's move on to transportation. It just astonishes me that for the second straight budget, getting ready for the show, I made a list of ways to raise revenue for transportation that the governor has said no to, and there's about 10 of them. So,
is that all?
Yeah, well, maybe I didn't have enough time. Maybe there's more. But, 2 years ago, the governor's budget that he signed into law authorized bonding of $991 million.
Essentially $1 billion.
Now he's saying 1.3 in bonding, and his summary of the transportation budget says no tax increases, no fee increases. He's very, very proud of that. But is that wise fiscal policy?
Well, I think what you're hearing from a lot of sort of traditional, Midwestern Bob Dole kind of Republican conservatives, we're not too into borrowing for everything. That's the federal government. They borrow for a third of what they spend, but we're not going to go there. But the comparison is fair, because the DOT budget is getting to the point where the debt service is significant.
Well, this year I looked it up. Fiscal Bureau scores it. Percentage of state transportation revenues going for debt service this year, 19%.
Yeah, and it's supposed to get up to about a quarter. Well, what's happening is what's going to eventually happen in the federal budget, which is the interest payments are going to crowd out other stuff. And so you're asking people to pay gas taxes and pay various fees, and those are user fees. They're our version of tolls, essentially, because we don't have tolls. But then you're not using the money for what you told them you are using it for. Right. You're using it to just pay off debt. So, well, and the other thing that should be said about transportation is we've had a transportation funding system that hasn't worked for over a decade, and every governor and legislature since almost the turn of the millennium has been kicking the can down the road. It's not hard to think about. People are getting older, so they're buying fewer cars, they're driving less.
The hybrid cars, the electric cars.
Vehicles are getting much more efficient, so they're buying less gas, you know, on and on. The gas tax revenue is actually going, you know, like this. So, you know, if you're fiscally conservative, it would not be incorrect to say we'd at least like to keep the amount of revenue flat. And that would actually require an increase in the gas tax or the vehicle registration fee. So a lot of it is semantics.
But on that note, we haven't raised the gas tax, as you know, since 2006. We haven't raised the $75 per vehicle registration fee since 2008. When I brought that up yesterday in a post-speech interview with Representative Dale Koinga, he said we have the 19th highest gas tax.
Scott Fitzgerald, but we have one of the lower vehicle registration fees too.
Right. Scott Fitzgerald also said my caucus will not buy a gas tax increase. So to buy down to reduce the 1.3 bonding for transportation, do you see some of these Republican legislators really going back to some of the tax and fee increases that Secretary Gottlieb recommended 2 months ago?
You know, I don't know, but there have been a couple people quoted in the press as saying, you know, we got to think about this more broadly. In fact, I think the Speaker and the Republican co-chair of Finance have both said we're not interested. We don't come here just to shove problems down the road. We are here to solve the problem.
Mr. Nygren did say that. Yes.
Now, if you don't want to increase the gas tax, you know, you can start to look at fees. You can also start to have a discussion about, well, if this is the amount of revenue we're going to take in, then our appetite for transportation has to shrink to meet that too. So, I mean, there's different ways you can go about the discussion, but it is interesting that the analogy to the federal budget situation and the federal deficit is very on.
Right. Meanwhile, these transportation projects are locally driven. Senator Harsdorf, who, by the way, has 2 four-year campuses, River Falls and Stout, she also
and almost Eau Claire.
And almost Eau Claire. She needs Wisconsin to pay its share of the new Stillwater Bridge. Legislators between Madison and Illinois want the interstate widened, and the Zoo Freeway, $1.7 billion, and the governor's budget bonding almost $1.3 billion, almost half of that to continue the Zoo Freeway and but then the Hone Bridge and the freeway west of Miller Park. So these are local projects that everybody wants, but nobody wants to step up and say, I'm willing to raise one of these fees.
Well, it's even more significant than that because, you know, local governments down at the town and village and city and county level, you know, we're not talking about the big projects, we're talking way down in the trenches, rely in part on state road aids.
Yes.
And as a share of the DOT budget, those have been following for some time. You know, if the governor and the legislature don't want to increase the gas tax or the vehicle registration fees, then maybe they should sort of say, well, local governments, you can piggyback on the gas tax. Or
the local sales tax.
You can, you know, they do have the wheel tax.
More wheel taxes.
Using, yeah.
That's right.
So, I mean, there are different ways to slice this, and, you know, local governments have been talking about that. In fact, we did a little study for some of them a couple months back suggesting that if the state really wasn't going to be able to fund road aids, that perhaps they had to start thinking of ways to some degree, break the tie with the state and do their own thing.
We've been talking about the UW system and transportation. Let me ask this. I don't think, I could be wrong, I don't think the governor mentioned Washington once last night in that speech.
But the theme of the speech was the American dream.
The American dream. When you watch the governor's budget speech and as you look through the details, is it clear to you this is a budget submitted by a presidential candidate, Todd?
I don't know if I should answer that, but I will tell you this, that it's an interesting budget because we're doing all this borrowing for transportation.
Yes.
And we're hiring a bunch of new tax collectors.
That's right. Let's land on that a little bit. The fine print in the governor's budget says, let's add how many new employees to the Department of Revenue to bring in some delinquent cash, right?
Yeah. In fact, the budget wouldn't be balanced if you don't bring in the cash. And auditors will bring in the cash. The question is how fast they can do it. But I mean, my point is, so we just have these interesting parallels. We're borrowing like the federal government for debt service, and we're in effect balancing budgets to the last penny. So we're always flirting with crisis because we can't estimate revenues perfectly. I mean, one of the main reasons we're in a problem right now is we overestimated revenues in the past biennium by, I think, $400 or $500 million.
And then when you have 3 or 4 tax cuts and you increase, you let people keep more by reducing the withholding tables, those are the reasons we're in this bind.
Well, and you got to remember that, and it's not all tax cuts, because the property tax cuts are being bought with spending. And so, let's be honest here.
Right. What strikes you about the fiscal ramifications of the governor's decision to turn down the Menominee Casino? Because right now the Potawatomi is starting to pay up. They already paid 25, and they're expected to pay another 25. Just the fiscal ramifications?
I don't know how to answer that question, because in the scheme of things, $5 or $10 or $20 or $25 million on a, whatever, how you want to count it, a $30+ billion or a $60+ billion budget just isn't a lot of money.
But when we asked yesterday, you're facing a $283 million deficit on June 30. How do you fix that? One of the first answer was, we've already got a cash transfer from the Potawatomi. We expect another.
Well, except we're talking about a $283 million problem, and the way they're really solving it is they're simply going to get rid of the pay increase they had promised state employees.
And they also say they're going to do unofficial things like no hiring freeze, and they're just going to squeeze.
Well, and you can also you can play games over the fiscal year. Oh, we won't write that check until July 2nd instead of June 30. That kind of stuff.
Right. Okay. Were you surprised that the governor's budget would withdraw Wisconsin from Common Core? Or is that an area that you don't?
Well, I don't think it's a big deal, in the sense that I think he's left it to school boards to decide, what standards they want to follow and what tests. So, I mean, it's one of those debates without maybe an answer. In the end, if a school board wants to, follow Common Core and test accordingly, they still can, if I'm not mistaken. So,
okay.
Now, it's interesting at the same time that we allow school boards that freedom. We're not going to allow them any financial freedom, because we're not going to change the revenue limit. But, they can vote if they want to increase it.
But let's talk about K-12 funding. He generally keeps it harmless, at least in the first year, correct? Is that a fair assumption?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's any growth in revenue caps at all, and I don't think there's a really much of an increase, if any increase in general aid in the first year. There is an increase in the second year.
Yes.
And he's claiming that the school levy credit is money for education, which is taking a
you and I have
page
discussed
from the
before.
Jim Doyle playbook, which is you raise the school levy credit and you say we're giving it to schools, but really it's going to taxpayers, but you get to have it both ways.
It's to control property taxes. let's talk about property taxes.
Yeah.
The governor's budget, his aide said yesterday, would cut the December 2015 average property tax bill on a median valued home by this many dollars. Is that any type of a victory other than allow him to say by December 2016 property tax bills will have gone down for 6 straight years? And then he added, how about that?
Well, first of all, the median, as you know, I don't like the median value calculation because it's you can make easier claims sometimes with that. If you look at the statewide levies, they have gone up. Very small, but they have gone up the last couple of years. And the way they're achieving it primarily until this past year was simply to impose limits on all kinds of local governments. Say you can't increase property taxes, you can't increase school revenue.
And they keep those limits in place to control property taxes.
Now, it's sort of interesting, and this is sort of goes to the what's a delicious irony when you put transportation and school finance next to the state revenue stream. The state revenue stream through the sales tax and the income taxes grows every year automatically. It grows with inflation, it grows with prices, it grows with income, and yet what's good at the state level is not good at the local level because we're going to clamp down property taxes and we're not going to allow the gas tax to rise as the sales tax does, et cetera, et cetera. So there's just lots of interesting ironies in all this.
On that note, the Fiscal Bureau predicts a 3% increase in GPR revenues 2016 over 15, 3.7% increase 2017 over 2016. Do you think those are realistic expectations? Too high, too low?
Legislators don't get this, and this is why we have budget crisis. Revenue estimating is part art, part science. The revenue people and the Fiscal Bureau people do a reasonable job. If they can come in within 1 or 2, 3%, they're doing pretty well. They're, economic forecasters often can't do that well. Right. But when you balance a budget in the current year by $0.3 million, you can be off by nothing on any one tax and you have a problem. And it's like that in the coming years, where the balances are always very small. It's just, you can't predict revenues precisely. You're going to be off by a percentage point or two, and when you multiply that by 15 billion, it's 150, 200, 300, 400 $million.
Are you comfortable with the predicted 3% upper in 2016, 3.7 in 2017?
It's realistic given the forecast for GDP. That's really what they're basing it on. They're basing it on what the economy looks like. You get a blow up in the Ukraine, you get a blow up in Iran, you get a blow up in Syria, you get a giant crisis in Venezuela. You get any one big crisis and the stock market goes haywire and a lot of people lose a lot of wealth and suddenly the tax collections are down and you have a problem. So, you estimate the best you can, and I think they do. The way you deal with the problem that there's going to be error is you keep reserves. And Democrats and Republicans in this state for decades have been unable to do that.
They're incapable politically to do that. Let me ask you about
but the result shouldn't be viewed as fiscally conservative. It should be viewed as fiscally irresponsible, because what they're setting themselves up for is future tax increases or spending cuts, which the public doesn't like.
We said earlier that the only new bonding would be about $1.3 billion for transportation. That's not really true, because there's a PS. Are you surprised at the governor's plan to using jock tax, taxes paid by NBA players, to support $220 million in bonds for a new Bucks arena if the current and former owners come up and Milwaukee City and County come up with $300 million? Is that a good deal for the state?
Well, I'll leave it to the folks in Milwaukee and the governor and the owners to fight about this. To me, it's going to come down to how, particularly Republicans in the Assembly, who tend to be more free market, more libertarian, how they feel about state government being involved in a private enterprise. Now, we can get into all the details and so forth. I think the earmarking of the athletes is in some way sort of gimmicky, but it makes for good politics.
No one wants to be the governor on which you lose the Milwaukee Bucks, though.
Yeah.
And Speaker Voss is the one that asked Fiscal Bureau to do the research of how much the jock tax would bring in.
Well, it provides the governor and legislature some political cover if they want to go that way, and one knows that if one just is up front and says, "How about a tenth of a sales tax to do this," as they did with the brewer, what was the end effect? Governor Thompson had to break every arm under the dome. And in the end, he broke one arm that didn't come back and recall, and they lost the Republican Senate.
Right. It's interesting to me. You and I have both been guests on public TV and radio. Any explanation for why the governor would eliminate $2.7 million that underwrites the programming for public TV and radio?
If you look in the executive budget book, what seems to be happening is they're reducing the general fund money and they're increasing what's called PRO. In other words, they're saying, go out and raise it.
Yeah. More fund drives? Oh
yeah. I said that last night, tongue-in-cheek, on public TV, but apparently I was right. I don't, to be honest, this probably is one of those things that makes for a good script, as I said, west of the Mississippi or east of Lake Michigan.
Fair enough. There are major policy changes dealing with two oversight boards. The governor would take the DNR board and the Ag and Trade Consumer Protection Board, which now make policy decisions for those agencies and make them merely advisory.
I don't get exercised about that, because every governor, going back to Pat Lucey at least, has believed in cabinet government. And if you believe in cabinet government, then the governor makes his appointments. If those appointees mess up, you can them. And if you really don't like it, you defeat the governor. And you either believe in cabinet government or you don't. And I tend to believe, personal bias, I tend to believe in cabinet government. Hire an executive, let him pick his team, and if you don't like what they do, throw them out.
The controversial proposal, at least in the eyes of Democrats, to drug test to qualify for public benefits. Your thoughts on that?
I really don't have anything. I haven't thought about it much. Obviously there's always concern about public money being spent for, welfare. It is interesting that is juxtaposed against what have been billions of new money for Medicaid since this administration took office. So, we're worrying about relatively small amounts over here. And not that we shouldn't. We don't want to waste money. People shouldn't be getting our money and going off and doing drugs. But putting it in the broader context, meanwhile, we're just spending hundreds of millions, billions on increasing Medicaid year after year after year.
Right.
And that's the big welfare program. Medicaid
in 2017 grows beyond $9 billion in all funds, state share. And 1 in 5 Wisconsin residents get their health care.
Well, the story of the Walker and Doyle budgets has been grow Medicaid, pretty much cut everything else.
Okay. Final question, Todd. You have been consistent. You've been critical of both Democrats and Republicans for making no major progress. Is this a budget that continues the pattern of not building up reserves? Because to follow that up, you say when you don't build up reserves, you lurch into this cycle of good times tax cuts, bad times cut spending. from that standpoint, is this a business as usual budget in terms of past practices?
It's very much like prior Doyle budgets and some of the prior Walker budgets. The unfortunate thing is, to give the governor credit, they took a bad situation in 2011 and they built balances, you know, $400 million, then up to $759 million. So that was a lot of heavy lifting. That kind of balance is what you need year after year after year if you're going to withstand the vagaries of the economy and revenue estimating. So they were there. The problem is they went from $759 million to minus $283 million in a span of 2 years.
Well, and you probably found it in here, the gap deficit projected in 2017,
yes.
$1.8 billion, but that's a subject for another show.
The gap deficit is going from 1.4 to $2 billion, yes.
I understand. Final question, the #1 initiative that you think will have the most trouble in the ledge in this budget? And then I really am done.
I guess transportation borrowing, maybe.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very good. Todd Berry of the Wisconsin Taxpayer Alliance, thanks for coming in to go through a pretty interesting budget.
Well, there's a lot more to go through. I mean, we'll spend weeks and months trying to figure all the little things. So,
the fine print.
Yeah. It's an interesting budget.
It is indeed. Thank you, sir.